prediction. Let's go back to Douglas, if I may. I'm keen to talk a little bit about the migration question here, because we've heard about the economic structures, but the reason your book in 2017 did so well, in a way, is that it chimed with this sense of something civilizational going on, or was there a question of European civilization? How was this being affected by the large numbers of new arrivals? In your analysis, is that what perhaps, amongst these other factors, but is that a key reason for why we then saw Brexit, why we then saw these populist governments or movements across the continent?
I think that the migration crisis of the mid-2010s was an extraordinarily important moment, but it was not the start of this particular challenge. The Mediterranean countries, principally, most famously Italy and Greece, had been coping with this question for a very long time and had been allowed, I thought, outrageously, to effectively cope with it alone. One of the things that made the migration question, I think, an issue that made so many people effectively see through some of the problems of the EU, I didn't just say see them, but see through them, was the talk from Brussels about the common policy. But the reality seen in the frontline countries, the reality of countries being effectively left alone to deal with this question. And all Italian and Greek citizens I've spoken to, whatever political persuasion, are aware that this extraordinary burden of how to deal with significant flows of people, significant pushes of people from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East and the Far East, is a very serious humanitarian, financial and other problem. And for all of the talk in Brussels, the reality remained that the countries were effectively holding this burden on their own. And it's only in 2015 that the reality of what was being expected of the Mediterranean countries was then having to be dealt with by the northern countries as well. And they reacted in a spasm and a policy that was not thought through, which they would not by any means repeat if they had the opportunity. But it was a demonstration that there was something fundamentally wrong with the procedures of thinking in Brussels. And if I can give one example very quickly, at one point in the crisis in 2015, I went from the Greek island of Lesbos to Berlin in a fairly quick succession. And I was speaking to one of Angela Merkel's supporters in the Bundestag, who explained why the EU's policy was worth sustaining. And I said to him, I've just come from Lesbos, and there are thousands of people currently stuck on that island. And they are stuck there because you have closed the borders unilaterally without telling people. He said, no, they're just not coming anymore. This is a point at which they'd slowed the process down somewhat. I said, no, they're not coming because they're locked on the island. And he said, and he kept insisting this wasn't the case. And I said to him, look, if you want, you and I can charter a plane now and fly the thousands of people stuck on the Isle of Lesbos right here to Berlin and speed up the process. And he said, no, it's not the case. And I thought the simple denial from the, for want of a better word, establishment voices in the EU and in Berlin and Brussels at that point, to me was staggering. And it undermined one of those central issues we have always heard from in the EU, which is the principle of solidarity. And solidarity is a wonderful principle, but it's a horrible thing if you speak it and do not practice it. And the EU on the migration question for years had spoken the language of solidarity and had resolutely failed to practice it. As I said, I think that everyone has issues like that where they've seen.
I just want to go to Yanis for a minute. We're trying to get your video back. Yanis, that moment that Douglas is talking about, I keep asking you whether you've evolved your views on things. I'm sorry, it's not meant to be an inquisition, but do you, at the time in 2015, you were broadly supportive of the idea that in one way or the other, large numbers of refugees needed to be accommodated within the EU, although you're critical, as I recall, of the way it was done. Do you now think that was a mistake, those large numbers coming into countries like Germany, like Sweden? Do you regret that?
No, not in the slightest. But let me agree with what Douglas was saying by quoting Mahatma Gandhi. You know, the famous quotation, you know, when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, he thought it would be a great idea. This is how I respond when I hear the words European Union or European solidarity. It would be a brilliant idea, except we don't have it at all, exactly as Douglas says. Let me remind you that in 2010, the bailout of Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, BNP Paribas, and Finanzbank, the four most of the most stupid banks in the world that went into serious insolvency. They fell into a black hole as a result of their trades of subprime derivatives in the United States. They were salvaged by means of the largest loan in human history, in absolute terms, not relative terms, that was given to the Greek state so that the Greek state could give it to these four banks, right? And you know how Mrs. Merkel passed this through the Bundestag, the federal parliament, as a package of solidarity for the Greeks, whereas it was solidarity for, you know, 2 German and 2 French banks. So it's not just that solidarity is not there, or the union is not there. It is that they are abusing the terms, giving those terms, beautiful terms, a terrible name amongst the majority of people. Now, let me come clean on the question of migration. I personally have absolutely no doubt that there is no such thing as a migration crisis, especially not in Europe. What there is a crisis for those poor souls who have to leave their bombed out homes in Syria, in Pakistan, or who, you know, abandon Ghana and Nigeria and prepare to, you know, die in the Aegean, to drown in the Aegean, in order to give their kids a chance of breathing, of having a life that is not a constant nightmare. Let me give you an example. Back in 1991, when the Iron Curtain collapsed, Greece was a country of 9.5 million people. Suddenly, as a result of the collapse, we had 1 million refugees, most of them, the vast majority of whom were Albanian Muslims. They came into the country. Greece was not a rich country in 1991. It was not an efficient country. We were not, you know, going gangbusters, but we were not in the throngs, in the clasps of a major crisis. You never heard of that. You know, 10% of the population came into the country. And you know what happened to them? They integrated. At the University of Athens, when I was teaching 10 years later or so on, their kids were some of my best students. I wouldn't even know that they were not Greek kids or kids of Greek descent if it wasn't for their surname. And Greece became a much better country. Our educational system was improved massively because we had a huge democratic problem because of migrants. What happened in 2015, and this is how I finish, what happened in 2015 was you had a defeated people. Greece had been turned into a debt colony of Northern Europe. Northern Europe had used Greece in order to salvage its own banks at the expense of Greeks who were being thrown out of their homes. Remember, there were 600,000 homes that were earmarked for foreclosure by the same banks that were saved by the same taxpayers. Okay? So the people of Greece felt like refugees in their own home when the influx of Syrians, Nigerians, and so on came. So that was the problem. It was not a cultural problem. Call me an economic determinist. But in the same way that in 1991 you would not have heard of the refugee crisis, you wouldn't have heard of it in 2015 if we didn't have this colonization of parts of Europe by parts of Europe.
Douglas, Yanis says it wasn't a cultural problem and it wasn't a migration crisis per se. Do you take a different view?
Yes, I mean, we obviously disagree on this. It certainly was a crisis. One of the reasons why we know it is because, as I say, it is not a policy that the EU has continued with. If it was such a great policy, the EU would not have started to shut the borders, try to beef up the Frontex agencies and more. They haven't done quite enough, as I see it. As we speak, the last 48 hours, several thousand people landed again on the island of Lampedusa, just off Sicily, and that's a little hint of the fact this could yet keep rolling as a challenge for the EU. But I also obviously disagree about the nature of the migration question. I think that, for instance, large numbers of Albanians going into Greece poses different issues than large numbers of Somalis going into Sweden, for instance. And one might debate exactly what those differences are, but they are differences and they do exist. the issues with migration always come down to the same two or three things: who's doing the moving, what the numbers are, and what the speed are. And clearly, the speed and the numbers, at the very least, of 2015 were unsustainable for the EU, which is why a panic set in from Berlin and Brussels, even from Stockholm, which meant that they pretended that they had meant to do what they did, and yet haven't done it again. You can tell an awful lot about political mistakes by that simple question of, would you do it a second time? And even a politician who's made a mistake once tends to not want to say it was a mistake the first time, but you can tell they think it's a mistake because they will not do it again.
So can I ask, Douglas, are you happy with? I mean, you talk about how there's now Frontex and there's much more border control, and actually some of the noises. Just this morning we had Michel Barnier, a potential presidential candidate, talking about how he wants an immigration freeze for a number of years coming up, and he's not happy with free movement as it stands. You know, in the year of COVID we've just had, the borders have been going up, the nation state has been everywhere. There's actually been a kind of nationalism in the air. Do you observe those things with happiness and think they are good developments?
Well, my own view in the last years is rather amusing, at any rate, to those of us who've talked about the issue of migration, that we've always been told that you can't stop migration. And here we are in an era where it's been completely stopped. You hear people who have been open borders advocates like Justin Trudeau in Canada suddenly saying no foreigners were allowed into Canada. I can't say I relish that kind of language. I don't enjoy it by any means, but it's interesting seeing it. As I say, that after a generation of being told that you can't stop migration by closing borders, we've been told that you can stop viruses by closing borders. So clearly there's some confusion about this. I'm not persuaded, incidentally, that people like Monsieur Barnier in his interjection this morning are by any means sincere. He is attempting to make a run in a country whose views have hardened significantly in recent years. We see political terrain able to be grabbed by somebody on the right who hopefully isn't a member of the Le Pen family. There is very clear open ground in France to Monsieur Macron's right. Mr. Barnier may well be trying to grab it. But I don't think it's anything more than that. And by the way, just to make one observation that's perhaps rather obvious, but I'll make it anyway, which is that if Monsieur Barnier had talked like this some 6 years ago, Britain might still be in the EU. It is quite extraordinary hearing the politicians who said nothing could be done about migration and much more, then doing this very reactionary swing to the right. And when they do it, they seem to do it, as Monsieur Barnier has just done, in this cack-handed way. They give people what they think people want, and they always just slightly get it wrong. So it's very nice seeing Mr. Barnier getting something wrong yet again, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yanis Varoufakis, let me ask you straightly here. You complain about the kind of neoliberal foundations of the European Union. It's all essentially a big business project.
No, don't put words in my mouth. I use the word neoliberalism because I think that it's meaningless.
Okay, so but the idea that
it's a cartel. You see, it's exactly the opposite.
Fine,
I have neoliberal friends.
But I just want to ask.
I have people that associate themselves with Friedrich von Hayek and Friedman, and they would not support a cartel economy like the EU.
Okay, so do you think...
We agree on this as well.
Do you think that immigration then, is there an argument that actually the free movement is really a capitalist project, and that the reason here in London we have had Greeks, highly educated Greeks, in hairdressers and pret-a-manger coffee shops in the past years is that essentially it's cheap labour for big businesses, and that a true kind of leftist solidarity position would be much more sceptical of all of that in and outflow of human beings.
Most certainly not. There is no doubt that there have been leftists who have been lured by National Socialism. Mussolini was one of them. And others who have not identified with fascism have fallen into this trap. Look, this conversation goes a long way back. There was a letter that Marx wrote sometime when he was a journalist to a friend in New York discussing the Irish question, the Irishmen mainly men, who were pushing down wages in the docks of New Jersey, New York. And usually what leftists in support of migration controls do is they quote the first part of that letter, but not the second. The first is a description that, yes, this is what they've been doing, the migrants, the Irishmen coming into New York, pushing down wages. But then the second part of the letter where Marx says, but yeah, the solution to this is to organize labor and to have different labor relations, not to stop the migrants from coming in. Look, I'm a left-winger because I am, I'm liberal. I'm a liberal left-winger. I cannot imagine that the left would ever want electrified fences as a means by which to support wages. And in any case, as an economist, I can tell you there's absolutely no evidence that in the medium run, let alone the long run, migration is detrimental to the interests of the local proletariat. But this is a long discussion we can have. Allow me to say, briefly about people like Barnier, like Macron. They prove that the last resort of those running the cartels in an incompetent and corrupt way is a kind of racism. They always fall back on it. And they always try to steal the thunder from the Le Pens and the Salvinis of the world when the Le Pens and the Salvinis of the world get stronger, not because of migration, but because of hopelessness. Look at Italy, for instance. Yeah, for the last 20 years, the per capita income of the vast majority of Italians has been falling steadily because of the policies of the Eurozone. Every year, for 20 years, Italy has been getting richer, but per capita for the vast majority is coming down. And at some point, these people get mad. They get mad at the political system. They do have, Italy and Greece, we do have a migration crisis. The European Union does not have a migration crisis. Because, Douglas, I have to say that you're taking that very short space of time of about 4 or 5 weeks during which Angela Merkel said that the Syrians come in, and you are making it sound as if that was the policy of the EU. The policy of the EU was always Fortress Europe. We always had very hard electrified borders, not letting people in. It was only during this period because Merkel felt that there was a political point to be made by letting the Syrians in particular in, not the rest. Right? And we've gone back to this Fortress Europe thing. It is the policies that have immiserated the many, especially in countries like Italy, southern Italy in particular, and Greece. They left those countries to their own devices to deal with the migration, very large numbers, and Lesbos and Lampedusa, as you mentioned. In other words, they have dissolved the very notion of a union. You deal with this problem, it's a problem of your own. And let me just add this, I'm sure you know this, Douglas, but the audience probably doesn't know it. It's not just that they've closed the Greek borders to the rest of the European Union. They created internal borders. They stopped the migrants from leaving Lesbos to come to mainland Greece. I haven't heard of internal borders since the Soviet Union, and which I'm pleased doesn't exist anymore. So this is what the European Union has been doing. And they are gross failures at the level of investment, at the level of unifying the European Union economically and socially, and bringing about a degree of social cohesion, translates into an adoption of ultra-right-wing, misanthropic, racist narratives. You can see this with Macron now. He's trying to steal votes from Le Pen.